On November 18, 1978, more than 900 people died in a place most of the world had never heard of. Not in a war. Not in a riot. Not because of a natural disaster. They died quietly, deep in the jungles of Guyana, under the direction of a single man. More than 300 of the dead were children. Many of them were poisoned first, while their parents stood nearby, powerless to stop it. The world would later call it mass suicide. But that word doesn't survive what actually happened there. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't a sudden breakdown. And it wasn't a group of people losing their minds all at once. What happened in Jonestown was planned, rehearsed, and made possible over years, slowly, deliberately, and in plain sight. Because Jonestown didn't begin with poison. It began with hope. It began with promises of equality in a divided America. Promises of safety for people who had never truly felt protected. Promises of belonging to those who had been ignored, dismissed, and failed by every institution that was supposed to care. And that's how it happened. Step by step, trust replaced doubt. Loyalty replaced freedom. And one man gained the power to decide who lived and who died. By the time the final day arrived, leaving was no longer an option. The choice had already been taken away. This is not just a story about a cult. It's a story about how easily control can disguise itself as compassion. About how warning signs can be ignored. About how ordinary people can be led somewhere they never intended to go. And once you understand how Jonestown happened, you'll understand. Something far more unsettling. It can happen again. Long before the jungles of Guyana, before the poison and the headlines, there was Jim Jones. A man whose vision of salvation was already mixed with control. As a child, he was obsessed with death and power, fascinated by stories of martyrs and self-sacrifice. By the time he became a young preacher, he was already staging faith healings, dramatic spectacles that drew crowds and earned trust. There was genuine charisma in his voice, in his promises, but behind it lay a relentless drive to manipulate, to shape people's loyalty, and to test the limits of obedience. People followed him because he offered something rare in 1950s and 60s America. His church welcomed black and white members alike in a time of segregation. He spoke against racism and inequality with conviction. He offered socialist ideals, community, shared resources, fairness, and most importantly, he delivered tangible help to the poor, the marginalized, and those who had nowhere else to turn. Jim Jones wasn't just preaching religion. He was building trust, forging dependence, and positioning himself as the savior in a society that had repeatedly failed its most vulnerable. Control disguised itself as compassion, and by the time anyone realized it, it was already too late. As Jim Jones' influence grew, the church he had built began to change. What started as faith and community slowly shifted into something darker. Loyalty became more important than belief, obedience more important than truth. Members weren't just encouraged to follow, they were expected to submit completely. Public confessions became a daily ritual. Men and women were forced to reveal their deepest fears, their private sins, their most intimate secrets, often under threats, humiliation, and the unflinching eyes of the congregation. The goal wasn't repentance, it was control. Women in particular were exploited. Sexual coercion was disguised as spiritual guidance or loyalty tests. Marriages were manipulated, relationships monitored, and children used as leverage. Members were pressured to hand over their money, homes, and possessions, binding themselves financially to Jones. Families were turned against one another, leaving trust in every other human being fragile, except for the man at the center. Language itself became a weapon. Abuse was called discipline. Punishment was care. Suicide was reframed as a revolutionary act. And leaving, the simple act of walking away, was betrayal. By changing the meaning of words, Jones changed reality. Morality shifted, resistance weakened, and obedience became natural. In Jonestown, there would be no question of right or wrong, only what he commanded. This was no longer a church. It was a machine built to obey. Jim Jones may have been the face of Jonestown, but he did not act alone. Around him was a carefully constructed inner circle. People who shared his vision, enforced his will, and made the horrors of Jonestown possible. Carolyn Layton, his closest confidant and strategist, was more than a follower. She wrote memos outlining mass suicide plans years before 1978, shaping the grim blueprint that would later unfold. Maria Katsaris, Jones' secretary and financial controller, handled the temple's money and offshore accounts. She helped ensure that members' finances, and by extension, their lives, were under Jones' absolute control. On the final day, she assisted in preparing the poison drink. Annie Moore, a nurse, brought deadly authority to her role. She administered poison to children, enforcing the leader's commands with clinical precision, and remained devoted to Jones until the very end. Larry Layton was the armed enforcer at the airstrip, the man who shot Congressman Leo Ryan and others attempting to leave Jonestown. His actions cemented the point of no return. Joe Wilson, known as Ram, oversaw security in the settlement, enforcing discipline and making escape nearly impossible. And then there was the Planning Commission, a bureaucratic body that coordinated punishments, labor, and loyalty tests. This was not chaos, it was a system. Jonestown did not fail because of one man's madness alone. It existed because a group of devoted aides, enforcers, and planners worked together, willingly or under pressure, to execute every detail. The mass deaths were not an accident. They were the result of years of careful orchestration. Jonestown was not a cult. It was a machine, and these were its gears. Most of the victims in Jonestown were Black Americans, and understanding why goes far beyond simple demographics. In 1950s and 60s America, Black communities were systematically failed by institutions. Segregated churches and social services offered limited support, and distrust of government wasn't paranoia. It was born from lived experience. Many had faced poverty, discrimination, and exclusion, and they were seeking a community that would truly see them. Jim Jones offered exactly that. He promised dignity, food, housing, and protection, things the wider society had consistently denied them. For many, People's Temple was not just a church. It was a sanctuary, a place where their voices mattered and their children were safe. Jones tightened his grip by controlling Social Security checks, orchestrating financial dependence, and positioning himself as the protector of their lives. He leveraged real fears of racism and violence, convincing members that leaving could endanger not just themselves, but their families. When complaints about abuse or coercion arose, authorities were slow to act, and Black families' warnings were often dismissed as overreactions or family disputes. The structural racism of the time didn't cause Jonestown, but it enabled it, creating an environment where trust in Jones could flourish while outside intervention lagged. This was not a story of gullibility. It was a story of exploited vulnerability, of people seeking hope in a world that had denied it to them. And tragically, that hope was weaponized. Jim Jones promised his followers a new world, a socialist paradise far from the injustices of America, a place where racial harmony was real and persecution could never touch them. To many, Jonestown in Guyana wasn't just a relocation. It was hope made tangible, a chance to live free, equal, and safe. The reality, however, was brutally different. Deep in the jungle, isolation became a tool of control. Armed guards patrolled the settlement, ensuring obedience and preventing escape. Loudspeakers broadcast Jones' sermons around the clock, his voice shaping thought, crushing doubt, and erasing outside perspectives. Life was punishing. Members were forced into grueling labor under harsh tropical conditions. Food was scarce, often inadequate, and medical care was a mixture of neglect, overmedication, and coercion. Even routine illnesses became opportunities for control. Jonestown was never a refuge. It was a psychological prison, meticulously designed to break independence, enforce loyalty, and make leaving impossible. What had started as hope became fear, slowly and invisibly, so that by the time reality set in, it was already too late. In Jonestown, death was not sudden. It was rehearsed. It was normalized. And nowhere was this more terrifyingly clear than during the so-called White Nights. These were emergency drills, framed by Jim Jones as preparations for revolutionary protest, but in reality, they were practice sessions for mass suicide. White nights were not casual events. Members were ordered to gather, often at all hours, and participate in exercises designed to instill panic, fear, and absolute obedience. Cyanide-laced drinks were sometimes simulated, weapons were displayed, and loudspeakers broadcast Jones' sermons, warning of imminent attacks from the CIA, fascists, or other enemies of the temple. The threat was always external, always looming, and always Jones' justification for control. Children were not spared. Entire families were forced to take part, teaching the youngest members that threat and death were normal parts of life. Parents had little choice. Refusal could mean punishment, humiliation, or separation from their children. Over time, these drills blurred the line between fantasy and reality, conditioning everyone, adult and child alike, to obey without question when the day came that the revolutionary suicide would be real. These rehearsals were psychologically meticulous. By repeatedly simulating death, Jones eroded natural resistance. Members who might have balked at the thought of suicide slowly began to accept it as a duty, a moral obligation, even an honor. Obedience became automatic. Fear became familiar. In a place where dissent could lead to public shaming, imprisonment, or violence, it was easier to comply than resist. The impact of White Nights was not limited to the mental conditioning of adults. The children of Jonestown were particularly vulnerable. They watched their parents' reactions, learned from their compliance, and internalized the message that resistance was impossible. Many of these children would later die in the actual mass killing, their understanding of life and death already warped by repeated exposure to rehearsal. Even the most loyal members began to experience doubt during these drills, but Jones' careful orchestration made questioning nearly impossible. The combination of fear, social pressure, and the constant presence of authority created a climate where doubt became dangerous. By the time any member considered escape, the psychological barriers were already too high, the emotional cost too great. White Nights also served a second, more sinister function, to weed out defectors. Anyone who refused to participate, who hesitated, or who displayed fear was noted by the inner circle. These individuals were punished or publicly humiliated, sending a chilling message to others. Disobedience was visible, shameful, and unsafe. Compliance was survival, and survival depended on absolute loyalty to Jones. Perhaps most chilling of all, White Nights made the unimaginable seem routine. The very idea of mass death, which would terrify any outsider, became an ordinary event in Jonestown. When the day of real tragedy arrived, the members were not shocked, they were prepared. Their minds, trained over months and years of rehearsal, understood the mechanics, the timing, the expected response. Death had become familiar before it became real. In the end, White Nights were a masterclass in manipulation, coercion, and psychological control. They demonstrate how Jonestown was not merely a community or a church, it was a machine designed to enforce obedience and normalize the unthinkable. Through these drills, Jim Jones ensured that when the final act came, resistance would be minimal, compliance near total, and the tragedy unavoidable. Long before Jonestown became a death trap, there were voices of warning, mostly women, whose pleas went unheard. Mothers, wives, and former members had seen the signs. Children coerced, women exploited, families torn apart. They reported abuse, sexual coercion, and extreme control, often detailing horrifying acts that should have prompted immediate intervention. But the world dismissed them. Their warnings were labeled as the complaints of disgruntled ex-members or exaggerations of overprotective parents. Letters and calls to authorities, even to social services and law enforcement, were ignored, delayed, or lost in bureaucratic indifference. Every ignored warning widened the gulf between life and death. Women were often the first to notice the exploitation. They described how Jones used fear, manipulation, and coercion to control families. They saw children being psychologically broken, parents forced to obey impossible orders, and members pushed to the brink of loyalty tests. Yet, in a society quick to question the credibility of Black voices and women's experiences, their observations were largely dismissed. Some brave women tried to rescue family members, alert the press, or even reach politicians. Their stories paint a picture of courage overshadowed by systemic neglect. They fought against both the machine of Jonestown and the indifference of the outside world. This chapter of the story is essential because it shows Jonestown was not an isolated tragedy or the result of blind devotion alone. It was a failure of listening, of taking early warnings seriously, and of protecting those most vulnerable. These women's ignored voices were among the last opportunities to prevent the disaster, making their silencing a key factor in the inevitability of the massacre. Jonestown was not a surprise. It was a preventable tragedy. And the women who tried to stop it remind us how often courage goes unheard when it challenges power.